property taxes. You are the few and the brave, and we do appreciate you. My name is James Quintero, and I'm the Director of the Center for Local Governance at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Together with my colleague Allegra Hill, we tackle the big problems at the local level, and we try to advance conservative thought and idea among all of our various local government units, cities, counties, school districts, and special districts. It's a big job, but as I like to say, it's good job security. Now, when it comes to the big local problems, few issues, if any, are as big and as challenging and as vexing as property taxes. Now, let me just throw a few data points out there so that you can get an idea of where I'm coming from. If you look at the Tax Foundation's latest national rankings, what you see is that Texas's property tax burden ranks as the 14th highest nationally. Now, if you look at the Census Bureau's data, what you see is that the per capita property tax burden is approaching almost $2,000. And if you look at the Foundation's own research, what you see is that property taxes over the last 13 years or so has grown by more than 100%. And you compare that to population and inflation, which has grown by only about 70%, you can see that we are on the wrong trajectory. So we have a big property tax problem here in Texas. But that's the bad news. I think the good news is that a lot of our state and local leaders recognize the challenge before us and have taken some good action to address the issue. And so what I'm hoping today is that my esteemed panelists can talk not only to the issue, but also to some of the solutions that are being put forward, not only in recent months and in recent sessions, but also as we move forward and try to address this problem. And so with that said, let me get out of the way, because we have a very great group here today with a lot of knowledge on the issue. And our first speaker needs very little introduction. He is the chairman of Ways and Means. Representative Dennis Bonnen serves the 25th Legislative District in the Texas House of Representatives, representing southern Brazoria County and all of Matagorda County. He was first elected to the legislature in 1996, and he began his 10th term of office in January 2015. He's also a member of the House Natural Resources Committee, and he is also the CEO and chairman of the board of Heritage Bank. Please help me welcome Mr. Dennis Bonnen.
Thank you. Appreciate being invited today. James, you really said everything that needs to be said in your introduction. This is a big local problem, and I hope people will keep that in mind, because I think one of the biggest problems we've had over the years, and ironically, since I've been in the legislature, my first session was 1997, we have legislatively cut property taxes 4 times, and no one has ever felt it for the most part. And the reason is because it's a big local problem. And, we've had that discussion. But I want to begin, and James did a nice job. I'll go a little further back than James did on some data points. But, the real question is, how heavy. Everyone says they want their property taxes cut and they're too high. And I would agree completely, but the real question is, how heavy is the property tax? And so let's look at what that really looks like, because I think it's hard for people to just answer that. So when you go back to the Tax Foundation, which I'm glad James used, because I think we all respect that as a really strong data point, data resource entity. So you look at it, we're the 6th highest property tax in the nation, according to the Tax Foundation. Now that sounds incredibly high, but you have to keep one thing in mind. We are one of only 7 states in the nation that does not have an income tax. So you do have to keep that to a certain extent of your calculation there when you're considering how high the burden of the property tax is. One of the real flaws in the property tax, in my opinion, is that when you put too great of a burden in one tax process, it becomes overly burdensome on the taxpayer. And I think that's the ultimate problem we have on property taxes. We're too reliant upon it. Now, with that said, I don't want anyone to think that I would suggest we should have a different tax like an income tax. I'm completely opposed to that concept. So knowing that the property tax is the sixth highest in the nation, that's not the complete story. It goes to some of the data points James gave us as an intro. According to the Legislative Budget Board, from 1992 to last year, 2 years ago, 2014, total property tax levies in Texas grew 63% faster than inflation and population. In other words, local governments are collecting substantially more taxes per person now than they did in 1992, and even after adjusting for inflation and population growth. If we wanted to return to the 1992 levels, we would have to cut an equivalent of 27% on the local property tax to be able to accomplish that. Yet another way you might put property tax in perspective is by comparison to the state and local taxes. So according to LBB, state taxes imposed that the state controls, sales tax, franchise tax, severance tax, et cetera, are not as overgrown as the property tax. From 93 to 2014, state general revenue increased only 12% faster than inflation and population. So remember, that's a 12% comparative to a 63% over the same period comparative to the property tax. So if you want to return the state tax back to a population inflation adjustment for 1992, you would have to cut state taxes by only 9.5% from their 2014 levels. So rather we would have to cut the property tax at the 2014 level by 27% to return to the 1992 levels. So I want to give you one more economic marker that will help put our tax burden in perspective, and that marker is personal income, which I think is one of the most important things to take into consideration when you're evaluating whether taxes are too high and making tax policy choices. So LBB data since 1992, personal income in Texas has grown slightly, just slightly faster than local property taxes. If property taxes and personal income had grown at the same rate over that period, property taxes levied in 2014 would actually have been about 5% higher than personal income growth. State level taxes have grown more slowly than the personal income since 1992. So from that indicator, we're doing a good job on the state side. So if the state had kept the pace with personal income, we would be paying about 29% more in taxes to the state of Texas than we actually are paying today. So that's obviously good news about our tax burden on a state level, and I don't want to suggest or tell you that I think we're just doing everything right. That's not the point at all. I'm only want to say that we're doing a lot of things correctly, and there's still not everything being done wrong, and there's still work to be done on property tax. So let me quantify the weight of the property tax burden so you could leave here with an idea of how much too high our property tax really is. And so if you look at three different measures, first, our residential property tax is the sixth highest in the nation. Sixth highest sounds like a really bad place to be, but again, don't forget, we're not paying in state income tax, which we're one of only 7 states who doesn't do that to you. Second, if you want to return to the property tax level of 1992 on a population-adjusted inflation basis, you would have to cut the 2014 property tax levy by 27%, which is an astronomical number. Third, the data shows that our property tax would actually be slightly higher if we wanted it to track growth in personal income, which of course we do not. Growth in personal income that exceeds growth of our tax burden is what makes Texas an attractive place to live and work and keeps drawing in new jobs, and we want that to continue. Of all these possible comparisons, the salient data point for me is that the property tax levels have dramatically outpaced population and inflation since 1992, and apparently everyone has a major objection to that, but yet it continues to happen. So that's a real challenge. The tax system that is controlling us and we're not controlling it is a failing tax system. So our goal with the Ways and Means Committee is to figure out how you can structurally change the property tax system so that it can be controllable, because I want to be clear, we can't control the tax itself. We don't levy it, and I'll talk about that now. So where do we go? You got to understand how this tax works. So first, We need to be clear, as I've said, it's a local tax. Property taxes are levied exclusively by local governments, and that's in our Constitution. The legislature does not control the property tax. I think voters, quite candidly, need to be better educated on that and not misled to be told that, hey, come talk to the folks in Austin and we'll fix your local property tax problem. We can't. We don't have the control. That control exists back in their home communities on a commissioner's court, a city council, a school board, and what have you. And I think that's a challenge that we need to do a better job with. Your property tax levy, the amount of tax you actually pay, as we know, two components. It's the tax value and the tax rate. And of course, the rate is completely controlled along with the value locally. The tax rate is set by the city, the school board, the commissioner's court. And in fairness to those entities, what they'll tell you is that when we have a budget meeting, no one shows up. And in the legislature, we've passed bills about truth in taxation, and you have to post in the newspaper, and you have to do all these things, and guess what still happens? No one shows up. So that's what the legislature can do. We need to improve that system so our citizens better understand it or able to better engage on the local level where the rubber meets the road on the issue. So when you look at the school tax, we do have some effort we've made there of trying to create discretion but put a cap in place, but quite candidly, the Supreme Court is currently making decisions about whether that cap is acceptable or not, and whether we can cap, and whether that cap's supposed to be higher, and therefore the local taxing districts will have more control over that. So similarly, we have no control over tax values. So the Constitution requires that taxable value be a market value, period. We cannot, do anything about what a market value is. And personally, I think that we get way too exercised over appraisals and the market value for the simple fact that that isn't what makes your taxes go up. It's the rate. And it's the dishonesty that occurs in the discussion of that. How many of us have been in communities where locally they say, well, we lowered your taxes. Well, no, they didn't. The values rose significantly and they slightly reduced your tax rate, which you still paid more in taxes. And they know that because those are the two levers of the equation and they control those levers. So it's not that complicated. We've made it probably more complicated than it ought to be, but you got to look at that. Quick data points I want to give you in that line, and I'm going to wrap up. So the state we're currently spending $9 billion each year going back to 1997 for property tax relief that we have tried to produce. And in spite of that $9 billion in annual spending, the property tax levies in the state have almost tripled since 1997, growing at light speed compared to population inflation. And the real simple thing is, why is this not working? Our buy downs, why does it not work? It's because the amount of property tax you actually pay is determined by your local elected officials. It's really that simplistic. We don't have that control. Let me illustrate it for you very quickly. The $10,000 increase in the homestead exemption that the legislature and the voters just passed overwhelmingly, Prop 1 in the November ballot, let me tell you the impact of that in Houston, HISD, where appraisals increased by 9.5% from 14 to 15. The school board voted to keep their tax rate, and this is the problem. The local elected official, and I'm not here to beat up the HISD, I don't know any of those folks, they'll go out and say, well, we kept our rate the same. Yes, but you increased 9.5% on values. And so the consequence of that is that in HISD, you actually will see an increase by $52 in 2015 in your taxes. And that's even after the $10,000 homestead exemption created $119 worth of savings. So all we did was reduce the pain of the increase, but again, it comes back to what that local rate was left to be. And again, I personally, as a property owner myself, I don't mind my value going up. What I take offense to is that my rate is not then effectually adjusted so that I'm not paying a great increase in taxation without anyone taking responsibility for that and acknowledging it. And quite candidly, whether the rate moves or not, we should hold folks accountable. Because the truth of it is, those are the two driving factors. They're the only real factors. Same issue in Austin. Austin ISD recently, they even went as far as to lower their rate by 2 cents, but they're still going to see an increase by $126 for the average homeowner in Austin ISD. So these examples illustrate that the amount you pay in property tax is ultimately determined by a local elected official, even if the legislature takes actions, as we have done several times, to increase the homestead exemption or buy down the local property tax. Even if your appraisal districts increases or decreases your appraised value, the amount of property tax that you have to pay is not decided until your school board or your city council or your commissioner's court sets the tax rate. So that's where the rubber meets the road on the issue. And what we need to do in Austin is structurally improve what happens within the confines of what they're able to do on the local level. But at the end of the day, until our citizens are better educated and better informed that they need to be sitting in the council chamber, the school board meeting, the special district places, and the commissioners' courts, they can't affect the property tax to the level that they would desire, and I hope we can. Thank you very much.
Very interesting data points there, Chairman. Very concerning as well. Well, our next panelist is one of my favorite Austin City Council members. Councilmember Ellen Troxclair serves Southwest Austin, District 8. She is a member of the St. David's Foundation, Neil, forgive me, Kosurik Scholarship Fund Committee, where she dedicates her time to raising scholarship money for Central Texas students wishing to pursue health-related careers. When she is not at City Hall, she is managing a successful real estate business. Please help me welcome Councilmember Ellen Troxclair.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so surreal to be here. Of all the things that I've done since I was elected about a year ago, this is the one that has been the most surreal because I came for so many years as a staffer. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm going to try to see if I can work this PowerPoint. Okay, so this is a good follow-up to what Chairman Bonin was talking about, because I'm going to try to show you how the things that he was discussing have played out in the local level here in Austin. Just to give you a little bit of background, this is, as many of you know, Austin went through a significant change recently in how we elect our city council members. We switched from an at-large system to a district-based system that allowed more fiscal conservatives like myself to be elected. So I represent Southwest Austin. Pretty much Zilker Park is at the top of the purple there, and so anything southwest of Zilker Park is my district. It's about 80,000 people. And one thing that's unique to my district, and a reason that property taxes is something that's so important and dear to my heart, is that I have the highest rate of home ownership in the city of Austin in my district. So almost 63%, and the average around the rest of the city is about 50%. So in my district, I have a huge, we're paying a significant portion of the property tax burden, and we're being severely impacted by the cost of living increases that we've seen at the local level. So, as Chairman Bonin was saying, part of the confusion of property taxes comes from the fact that there's so many different taxing entities. The city of Austin, I have people that are upset, that rightly complain to the city of Austin because of our property tax rate, and sometimes they don't understand that a lot of their tax burden also comes from all these other entities. So here in Travis County, this is where, if you own a home here, this is where your property taxes are going. You have AISD, you have Austin Community College, you have Central Health, the county, and the city of Austin. And the median tax bill overall is almost $6,000 for the average home of about $240,000, which, as we all know, it's pretty hard to find a house for $240,000 these days in the Austin market. So a lot of people are paying significantly more than that number. And the Austin portion of that number, which is what I'm going to kind of delve into here, is about $1,200, and represents about 20% of your total tax burden. So this slide is meant to represent how the actual amount that you pay in your property taxes does not, how that compares to your actual tax rate. As Chairman Bonin was saying, sometimes the tax rate goes down, but the actual amount that you're paying in taxes goes up, which is why so many local elected officials and newspapers like to talk about the tax rate going down. Of course, in the city of Austin, we have such huge growth. We have so many people moving here every day. We have property values skyrocketing to the point where we are able to bring in a significantly more revenue while saying that we have lowered the tax rate. So here you can see how that has transpired since 2005, over the past 10 years. We started out with a tax rate of 0.443 and a total tax burden of about $713 for the median homeowner. And over the years, several times there have been dips in the tax rate, but the actual dollar amount that you owe goes up. And that has been even more pronounced over the past couple of years because, again, this accelerated growth that we've been seeing. So even though we were able to go from a tax rate of 0.5029 to 0.4809, the actual amount that the homeowner is paying, even with a homestead exemption, even with the local homestead exemption and all these other things that we've done that I'm going to tell you about, the average homeowner is still owing, over $100 more than they did before. So this speaks to just the confusion of the problem. What is the difference? What is the appraised value versus market value? How does this affect inflation? What is the tax rate versus tax bill? And here is a good representation of how this compares to population plus inflation. If you look at the top line, this is the population growth in Austin between 2005 and 2014. So as you can see, it's pretty steadily increased. We've gone from about 700,000 people to almost 900,000 people. But again, a very steady increase over that time. The second line down that you see, the middle line, is general fund spending. So even though the City of Austin has a total budget of about $3.5 billion, we're talking here specifically about the general fund, which is funded about 50% with property taxes. So we have gone over that same time, while population only increased 25%, the general fund spending has increased 75%. And you can see how the line is not equal. There's spikes in that line, and it's rising faster than population, which means that, we always talk about growth paying for itself. Well, in this case, growth is not paying for itself because we're continuing to spend more, we're continuing to outpace spending compared to population. And then if you look at the bottom line, that is the total property taxes collected by the city. And that number has increased 144% over that same time period, which is just insane to me. So what are the solutions from the local level? Here are some short-term things that I've been working on over the past year that I think will make a little bit of an impact. First is we've done something called a taxpayer impact statement, which is an attempt to provide a little bit more clarity to the average taxpayer about where their money is going and how much money they're actually paying above and beyond just seeing the tax rate printed in the paper. So this is a simple statement that outlines not only your property tax bill in actual dollars, but also charges and fees from Austin Energy, Austin Water, Austin Resource Recovery, the Clean Community Fee, the Transportation User Fee, the Drainage User Fee, all these fees that you may not have even realized that you were paying. They're all kind of folded into mainly your utility bills. So if you add all those up, you get an actual dollar number. This year, that dollar number, the total increase in dollars that the median homeowner will pay is about $43, which doesn't seem like that much, but I think that it would have been much higher had we not had some fiscal conservatives advocating for responsible spending on the council this time. And so the idea behind this is that every taxing entity in the city or in the county would produce a similar statement before they officially adopt the budget, the tax rate for the year. So Travis County, AISD, Central Health would all do this similar statement, so you could add up all those numbers and see what allow you to responsibly budget next year for what you're going to owe in your total tax burden. So the homestead exemption is something that we've talked about a lot at the state level and at the local level. For those of you who don't know, the homestead exemption means that if you're by state law, you are allowed up to 20% exemption on your property taxes if you own and live in your home. So if you have a home that's worth $100,000, and you have a 20% local homestead exemption, you're only taxed on $80,000 of that valuation. But again, it's up to each local taxing entity to implement this. So although we have a full 20% homestead exemption in Travis County, and the cities of Dallas and Houston also have a full 20% homestead exemption, this year was the first time that the city of Austin decided to make use of that tool allowed by state law and implemented a homestead exemption. So unfortunately, although there were a couple of us that pushed for the full 20% homestead exemption, the number ended up at 6 with the commitment to get to 20 over the next 3 years. So if you own your home, I hope that you will see a little bit of relief on your property tax bill. But to the last point, over time, if we don't utilize these tools in conjunction with getting spending under control, the relief will eventually be erased, because it doesn't do you any good to get a 20% reduction if your total property tax bill is increasing more than that, over the decades. So the next thing that I was really excited to do was what we called a taxpayer refund. When we were going through the budget this year, I was able to find about $4 million that that if we cut that money, it really wouldn't impact any basic city services. So I was really excited to bring forward a budget amendment that said, hey, I want to take this $4 million and I want to give it back to the taxpayers by applying it to the tax rate and lowering that tax rate. Unfortunately, when you come up with $4 million and when you have other people on the council who have other projects that they want to use that money on, that amount got whittled away because they saw, oh, well, here's a pot of money that we can take and use for something else or use for my project. So unfortunately, it got whittled down to only about $1 million. And even at that, it only passed 6-5, so it barely passed. But we were able to pass it. So for the first time in history, this was the first time in Austin City Council history where a chunk of money was actually set aside and we said, how about we don't spend this money, how about we give it back to the taxpayers? And the great thing about that is that not only is it a slight benefit for this year, but it also lowers the effective and the rollback rates for next year. Because we applied it to the tax rate and just didn't send you a check for it in the amount of money, next year our effective and rollback rate will be slightly lower, which means the city will be a little bit more limited in the maximum amount of money that they will be able to spend. Thanks, y'all. So here are some longer-term solutions that that I think are mostly need to be done at the local level. First of all, spending caps and affordability goals. We don't have any population plus inflation limit on the amount of money that we're spending. Collaboration amongst taxing entities. We have formed what we've called the Regional Affordability Committee, where we have members from each of the local taxing entities meet quarterly to talk about coordination with each other. And my goal, what I have proposed to them, is next year, instead of just kind of sitting around and thinking of ways that we can improve affordability, we actually come up with a limit, a cap between ourselves, between all of the taxing entities, and say we are not going to exceed this total dollar amount for the average homeowner next year, which I don't think has ever been done before, but I think would require incredible cooperation between the taxing entities, but I think would be a really good show of faith to the taxpayers that we're trying to address it in a comprehensive manner. So alternative funding sources, I am speaking to the hotel occupancy tax. Austin in particular has seen a huge increase in our hotel occupancy taxes because we're such a tourist destination. We have so many people visiting our city. Well, by state law, a portion of those taxes can be set aside to be used on activities that drive tourism and continue to help us collect sales tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera. Well, right now, the largest event hosts, one of the biggest events worldwide, South by Southwest, instead of using money from hotel occupancy taxes to support that event, the city is subsidizing that event out of the general fund, out of your property taxes, which is just insane to me. I mean, we're spending hotel occupancy taxes on a lot of other things like community art and, a long list of things. But I think that you cannot argue that there's another event, like South by Southwest, that brings the amount of tourists that event does to Austin. So we really need to look at, unfortunately, we've come up a lot against the attorneys saying, well, state law really limits us into what we can spend it to. And but when you look at other cities are spending that money on events like South by Southwest, and this is the exact kind of event that this money should be used for. So we need to tap into that, which means we can not be spending that money out of the general fund and lower your property taxes. General fund transfers, we are transferring in the city of Austin about $105 million every year from Austin Energy to the general fund, and $40 million from Austin Water to the general fund. That is in addition to about another $15 million that those two utilities are transferring directly to individual departments like the Economic Development Department. So to me, if we can really be more transparent in the way that we're spending our money and stop and put the brakes on some of those transfers, we'll be able to lower utility bills, which will overall lower the cost of living. And then, of course, limit spending. That's a no-brainer. Sunset process, I'm looking into doing something similar to what the state does, and reviewing all the city departments on a regular basis and making sure that our programs and departments the money is being spent effectively and are accomplishing what they've set out to accomplish. And then, two of the biggest cost drivers are automatic wage increases. We give, all of our city employees pretty much at least a 3% raise every year. My efforts to curb that this year were unsuccessful, and long-term pension reform, I think, has to be addressed if we're going to get spending under control. So that is it for me. That's my contact information if y'all have any follow-up questions or want to get in touch with me, and I appreciate y'all letting me be here.
Wow, what an absolutely great list. I love it. Our next panelist is a longtime champion of property tax reform and is very well known around these parts. Tax Assessor Collector Cheryl Johnson was elected to the office of Tax Assessor Collector in the fall of 2004, becoming the first Republican woman to be elected in a county-wide seat in Galveston County. Cheryl's public service record includes 2 terms as a trustee of the Clear Creek Independent School Board and 15 years as a director of the Galveston Central Appraisal District Board, 3 as a voting member, and 2 as its president. Please help me welcome Ms. Cheryl Johnson.
Good morning. I've agonized over how to spend these 13 minutes provided, and I decided that I was going to tell you my story, as boring as that might be for some of you, but I found that my political story kind of paralleled the problems that we've had in the property tax system over the last 25 years. So hopefully it'll help communicate the flaws that are in the program and maybe help us identify ways, although I've heard some wonderful ways to fix it already. As everyone knows, the PVTO bill passed in 1979, and it was just being fully implemented when I arrived in Texas. It created our current system, and it was intended to create fair and uniform taxation through the creation of the county appraisal districts, eliminate inconsistencies and inequities in valuations, and fairness was to rule the day. Does anybody sitting here today feel like that's what we accomplished? I don't. In fact, what we did get was election platforms, and my own was included in that. So mine began in 1993. The county education districts were eliminated. We lost a 20% homestead exemption. Senate Bill 7 became law, and my house payment went up $90 a month. Now, that doesn't sound like a great deal of money, but we were a family of 4 living on 1 income. And $90 a month took care of Christmas, but that got impacted, birthdays, vacations. All of a sudden, our disposable spending was gone. It was gone. So I did what all responsible citizens should do, and Mr. Chairman, I know that you appreciate that. I went to the school board, and I asked for them to increase the homestead exemption, put it back the way it was, because they were going to get more money, or to cut the tax rate. I was admonished. I was told it wasn't their problem, it wasn't their fault, and if I had a problem, I needed to go to the legislature and complain. Well, what I did instead is I ran for school board. And so my platform was to adopt a 20% homestead exemption, and I won in a runoff election. by 44 votes. Wasn't a whole lot. But I did win, and over the next year, we changed out 2 other school board positions. We helped 2 others rethink the situation. That probably is the nice way. I took a lot of very controversial issues to those school board meetings and loaded up their backpacks with so many rocks that they were going to sink if they didn't join us. We passed a 10% homestead exemption after we had defeated an excessive bond referendum. So we did exactly what the chairman says you should do, is get involved in local government. We did. It was exhausting. Before long, I was appointed to serve on our CAD board, and I began driving to Austin to find out what's all the hoopla about. What's going on up here that they're not doing, because according to some of the members of my school board, it was a legislative problem. So you go back and you look what's happened. In response to those taxpayer complaints, the homestead exemption was increased from $5,000 to $15,000, now to $25,000. The appraisal caps were approved. Now, school districts may or may not have been fully refunded on that appraisal cap legislation. Clear Creek was not. And the electric became more knowledgeable, but they went back to sleep. I took a break from politics, but 5 years later, with property values again wildly out of control, we built a house for $50 a square foot, and that was $105,000, and my first appraisal notices was $175,000. When you show up to an appraisal district with a bag of receipts and say it can't possibly be worth more than it costs to build, you can get it reduced a little bit. But I followed Harris County Tax Collector Paul Betancourt's lead, and I became Galveston County's cut tax assessor collector, and I was, pardon the expression, hell-bent on representing property owners, and that's what I've been trying to do ever since. The advantages that I possessed in this position is I was a former real estate appraiser, so I understood real estate. I was a former school board trustee, so I knew about how difficult it was to raise and cut taxes. I'd worked at the CAD. I wrote their appraisal manual in Galveston, so I knew exactly what they were doing. And I had performed a management audit to find out what they were doing that they shouldn't be, and it was a tremendous amount of things that they were doing that they didn't have to be doing, that all of our local governments were paying for. And since I'd been a voting member of the CAD, I understood how that politics and dynamic worked. So I had essentially cut my political teeth on this tax system, and I could speak fairly knowledgeably about it. And although I knew how far we had come, I also knew that we had a lot longer way to go. Today, 11 years as a county cut tax assessor collector, I'm not any happier than I was 22 years ago. Thanks to many, many people, and several that I see here in the audience and several that are on agendas of this program. There was change after change after change made, but with the most recent being the homestead exemption, but nothing has been sustainable. But we did over those years elect responsible people both in our local government and our state government, but we continue to have a system of taxation that responds to economic development and bounty with higher property values and higher taxes. As you all know, the demand for real estate drives a market value-based system. Since nothing has solved the problem, we have to look at it. What do we do? So with the prompting of one of my local cave people, and we all have them, Citizens Against Virtually Everything, right? We all have them. I had a man that showed up at my doorstep almost every month without fail to say, you've got to read this, you've got to read this, you've got to read this. And what it was the Supreme Court ruling on Prop 13. And it's like, yes, I'm going to read it. Yes, I'm going to read it. Yes, I'm going to read it. And finally, I had no choice. I wanted him to stop coming to my house. Although I agree with the chairman that we need an informed and engaged electorate, asking local officials to lower the tax rate is not going to help the burden in the short term. It will help in the long run, but we really have time for that. In my county, over half of the values went up last year. In my neighborhood, because they're identifying value and increases by neighborhood, and in different counties, they do neighborhood a different way. In my neighborhood, every single house went up $100,000. In order for our taxes to have been the same as last year, with a 10% appraisal cap and with the increase in the homestead exemption for school districts, my local governments would have had to collectively lower the rate 40%. That's not going to happen. That's an unreasonable expectation. This system increases some areas and not others. So the disproportionate increases are happening only in some parts of town. So to truly cut our taxes, even with a 10% appraisal cap, I think that what we have to do is really reform the system. The Lieutenant Governor has stated that through the Senate Select Committee on Property Tax Reform and Relief, he wants to find solutions that will ensure every Texan receives lasting property tax relief, meaningful tax relief. He supports appraisal reform. I've known Dan Patrick a long time, we're friends. I've known Senator Betancourt a long time, we're friends. But the real solutions are really going to require courage. Profound courage and change, real change. As a member of the Texas Policy Foundation, I would think all of you are, right? Well, you have embraced liberty, personal responsibility, and free enterprise. This tax system does not support those concepts, not in any way, shape, or form. In order to continue a pro-growth atmosphere, we must continue to reduce excessive spending. My hat is off to our legislators who have done a really good job with that. Your revenue limitations have been incredible, and thank you. It's been very meaningful. But what we also must do is limit the tax burden. We have to stop the bleeding, not slow the bleeding. And in order to stop the bleeding, we have to change the basis from market value. We can end the taxes two-step by moving from a market value-based system to a price-paid system of taxation. I have a brochure. I don't know what I did with my little brochure. So look on your tables, and you'll see this ending the taxes two-step. I'm not going to read it to you. I would not insult you in that way. But I'm going to encourage every single one of you to take this with you and read it. And in particular, read the convincing argument that starts on the back. This is words from the Court of Appeals in California and the U.S. Supreme Court. And the member who wrote the majority of this information was a Reagan appointee. I can tell you that this is a very conservative finding. But the highlights of this are adopt price paid as a basis for taxation. That creates a progressive tax system for Texas, putting the taxpayer in charge. By the purchasers rendering their value, you could vastly eliminate the need for a county appraisal district. I don't think we need them anymore. That's $400 million a year in local government expense that we could eliminate. Would that help any of you? No more annual appraisal increases, so our citizens aren't having a fit every year. No more property value protests or need for the ARB, although we'd probably need a state board of equalization. No more unilateral value increases in Houston, in Austin, in Smithville, in Katy, wherever you are. No more unilateral value increases. True market value occurs when there's a meeting of the mind of a buyer and a seller. And so the only point in time you have real market value is when that sale occurs. So I present to you that the real market value should be what we paid for the property, period. End of conversation. A price-paid system will create, as it has in California for 38 years, a stable revenue source for local government, while putting the property owner in control of the tax liability. If you can't afford the tax, don't buy the house. That's easy. When I paid my $50 a square foot and built my own house, I could afford that tax. The tax I pay today bears no relation to my ability to pay, and that's not right. As you can see from the chart in the brochure, and I kind of did it because it pains me this way, is the red lines are the increases in value, and the green is the increase in revenue. California in 25 years saw an increase in revenue for local governments from $15 to $52 billion a year. That's almost 10% a year. Is there any government here that can't live on that? I dare say they all could. Don't tell me you don't want to be like California. Governor Jerry Brown has really done a great job to pull the state back into order. Part of Prop 13 included a 2/3 vote of the legislature to increase state spending, and they eliminated that. They totally dismantled it in 1990, and I think that's why California had so much crisis. But he's really pulled them back into order. But for 38 years, through all the years of that financial crisis, the tax based on price paid that was voted in 2-1 with an initiative and referendum in California provided a stable revenue source for local government. I've researched Prop 13 for 9 years. You can see my notebook. It kind of blocked Mr. Levine, and I apologize, view of the PowerPoint presentation. But that's the research I've done. That doesn't count the PDF files that are sitting on my computer. In that notebook, there's a really neat article that John Fund wrote. We all know John. But he told a story that carries a profound message, and I think every elected official needs to hear it. Mr. Fund was an intern in the California State Legislature when Prop 13 passed. He tells the story of the Assembly Republican leader who had gathered his caucus members to share what had happened at a town hall meeting that day. And he said, and I quote, "I was there to explain to them that Prop 13 would be a disaster, reminded them that only 4 out of 120 state legislators had even endorsed it. I stood up before 800 people, the greatest number that had ever shown up at a town hall meeting, and I said, if Prop 13 passed, it would decimate local services. It would destroy their schools. It would lead to disaster. I told them if they voted for it, local government as they knew it would end, and I got a standing ovation. Think about that. The people had said enough, great, get rid of local government because we're not happy. I don't know about you, but that's not what I want for my local government. I want them to respect their elected officials. I want them to appreciate the services that they get. I have the unenviable job of taking people's money every single day, and they tell us how much it pains them. We see it. Galveston County is very mixed in income. So we have the very, very poor and the very, very rich. But I can tell you that without exception, if we don't do something, if we don't make some tough decisions and put into place a system of taxation that will put the taxpayer in control of the bottom line, we'll be here in 2 more years having this very same discussion. It's not going to end. This is a system, Mr. Levine, that will adequately and equitably support the Texas of tomorrow. And Ms. Troxclair, without lawsuits, and Mr. Levine, you would appreciate that too. And Mr. Chairman, without more years of frustrating attempts and overly long committee hearings trying to figure out what the solution should be. The Act of 1839, the Texas Homestead Law, was adopted to protect the family homestead from seizure by creditors and to provide favorable tax treatment to property owners. It's time to stand behind the Texas Homestead Law and deliver a tax system for Texans that will provide the protection they deserve, one that will provide tax certainty. This should be studied during the interim and decided in the next session. There's data that can be collected from the Data Research Center at Texas A&M to go back in time and look to see what would have happened if we had done this to ensure that this is going to be a stable revenue source for Texas. I do believe that we simply don't have time not to do something. And I have other ideas, and I think we'll share them as we get through this panel. Thank you.
Very, very interesting. All right. Our next panelist is one of my absolutely favorite sparring partners. Although we don't always see eye to eye, he definitely has earned my respect for his knowledge of the issues. Dick Levine is a senior fiscal analyst at the Center for Public Policy Priorities. Before coming to the center in 1994, he was a senior researcher at the House Research Organization of the Texas House of Representatives for 10 years. He's a chartered financial analyst, chairman of the board of directors of the Travis Central Appraisal District, and a member of the executive board of AFSCME, Texas Retirees, the statewide union of local retired public employees. Please help me welcome Mr. Dick Levine.
Thank you very much, James. It's always a pleasure for me to be here. It's an opportunity for me to speak to audiences that might not come to hear me alone, but will come to hear Chairman Bond and the other panelists, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, especially because of the thoughtful presentations that we've all heard. Rather than respond directly to most of those, I want to make just 1 or 2 quick points on things that they have said. And then what I'd like to do is to present 3 ideas that I'm hoping all of us can agree upon. Let me just say of my reaction to the prior presentations, one very important thing that everybody has emphasized is that setting property taxes is a 2-step process. There's the setting of the appraised value, which is done by the central appraisal districts in each county, and then there's setting of the tax rate, which is done by the school board, the cities, the counties, the community college, the hospital districts, and everything else. At least in my mind, that first step, the appraisal step, should be just a technical process. Using the best information available and the best techniques available, the appraisal district should do the best job possible of setting market value. And then, of course, there's the provisions to come in and protest to the appraisal district, the appraisal review board. You can go to arbitration. You can go to district court. But still, that is step 1, and it really should only be about what is the correct market value. Step 2 is the tax rate setting, where each one of those entities I mentioned sets their budget. They know what the taxable value is in their jurisdiction, and then they set the tax rate to raise the money they feel is necessary. The problem has been there's been too much attention on step one and too little on step two. In Travis County, we had 106,000 property tax protests, which we dealt with through the process I mentioned with the ARB and the rest. Now, council member, I don't know, but I would be astonished if you had 106 people come to talk about tax rates. And I think that's part of the problem, is the focus is on what I think at least ought to be just a technical procedure and too little focus on what's really the political procedure and where there really should be more room for public input. The second point is when we're talking about the property tax bill as a whole, and as the council members' PowerPoint showed you, half of that tax bill, more or less, comes from school districts. School districts are different from cities and counties and the other special districts. They do not necessarily get more money when values go up. For a city or county, when property values go up, if they don't change their tax rate, they'll get more money. That's why we have the effective tax rate calculation, where they're supposed to start with a revenue neutral rate, at least on the property that they taxed in the prior year, and then there's limits to how much they can go up from that. That's what we've been talking about. For school districts, it's different. Because of the school finance decisions, going back to the Edgewood decisions in the 1980s, the amount of money that a school raises in total state and local revenue is independent of their property values. Now, nothing in school finance is that simple, but by and large, that's the overarching principle, that the amount of money that a school district can raise is independent of its property values. That's the whole idea behind the education available to Texas students should not depend on their zip code. But what that means is that half of your property tax bill is more or less set in stone, because even if your value goes up and your taxable value goes up, the school district does not benefit cannot keep its revenue neutral by cutting its rate. If it cuts its rate, it will lose money because the state will not make up the difference. So that's something that you have to look at when you're looking at total tax bill. Remember, half of it is essentially fixed in the school district's tax rate because of the nature of our school finance system. Now, I want to talk about the three things that I am hoping that all of us can agree upon. One is the homestead exemption. And the council member mentioned that the city of Austin has just for the first time instituted a homestead exemption of 6%, hoping to grow it to 20% over the next few years. That's the only option that's available to them at this time, is a percentage exemption. School districts, on the other hand, and I think Chairman Bonin mentioned it, have a flat dollar amount exemption, which was recently raised to $25,000 by a vote of the people last November. $25,000 homestead exemption means that whatever your appraised value is, the first thing that happens before they figure the tax bill is they subtract $25,000 off that value. Most school districts have, let's say, a $1.20 total tax rate. $25,000 off your taxable value means about $300 off your school tax bill, regardless of the size and the value of your home. That's the way schools do it. They can also, some of them, have an additional percentage exemption. But cities, counties, hospital districts, community colleges, and the rest do not have that choice. They can only give the percentage exemption. So my first proposal is to give the local option of either percentage or flat dollar amount. There are advantages and disadvantages to going both ways. I can argue with them with you, but the point is it should be a local control issue. And you should make available to city councils and commissioners' courts the same options that school boards already have. Actually, school boards are required to give a flat dollar amount exemption. Cities, counties, and the rest are prohibited from giving that very same exemption. I think we should open that up to local control. This was a bill and requires a constitutional amendment also that was filed past session. It passed the Senate 31-0. Came out of Chairman Bonin's committee by a vote of 8-2. It was placed on the calendar on the last day on which bills could pass on second reading, but it was placed low on the calendar and they didn't get to it before the midnight deadline. So it had broad support, it came that close to passing, and I am looking forward to having a broad base of sponsorship, see if we can't do it again next session. And that's been described here in this thing. It says, a better way to help Texas homeowners, that I hope you all found on your chair. Now, my second proposal has to do with the over 65 tax deferral. You hear so much about seniors being taxed out of their homes. There is already a provision in state law that when you turn 65, you can defer your property taxes. That means you will no longer have to pay them every year. They do, however, get deferred. They're not extinguished, and you will owe them, or your heirs will owe them, when you leave your home and either go into a nursing home or pass away, and your heirs get your home. When they sell the home, they have to pay the back taxes. That seems like a good system, but there's one problem, which is you would owe 8% annual interest rate on that deferred taxes. That's a rate that was set when there were high interest rates. There are no longer high interest rates, but that 8% has been stuck in statute ever since. And what we should do is recognize the current market rates and peg it to something like the prime rate plus, say, 1%. And I think, Ms. Johnson, I've seen that on your website. So I think I have a leg up trying to get agreement from all of us on that. Because we recognize there's problems of people who bought their homes long ago. They are now retired, they have fixed income, their property taxes are going up. This is a provision that will keep them in their homes, but the rate that's being charged now is totally unreasonable, and it should be adjusted to reflect real market rates. And then my third proposal has to do with the notice of appraised value. This is the notice you get usually around April from your appraisal district, tells you what your appraised value is, and it also lists your various exemptions. Your homestead exemption, if you're over 65, there's a tax freeze for your school tax bill, and in some places on your county or city tax bill. There's also the 10% cap. The taxable value, rather, of your homestead cannot go up more than 10% a year. There's a number of things that have already been enacted by the legislature to help protect homeowners from undue burden. Most people don't recognize and appreciate what those are. And what I would like on the notice of appraised value is to state very clearly, here's your homestead exemption, for instance, the $25,000 homestead exemption for school taxes that I mentioned. And then in the next column say, this is reducing your tax bill by $300 this year. Do the same thing for the city homestead exemption, the freeze, the 10% cap, and all the rest. When you go to Randall's, when you go to CVS and you use one of their cards, they will put on your receipt, you have saved blank. I think we should have the same thing on notice of appraised value, and I think that might help Chairman Bonin and the members of his committee to feel like what they're doing is actually appreciated. Even though, as he mentioned, sometimes the values go up and the total tax bill is not cut the way taxpayers expect it to, it is in fact lower than it would have been. That's difficult to explain to taxpayers, but if you spell it out on the notice of notice of appraised value, I think they would see it. I think they would recognize what the legislature has done and be much more realistic in their demands when they come in or when they talk to city council, have a full understanding of how their tax bill has been calculated and what they would have been paying and what they are paying instead because of the various exemptions. That's all I have. I'd like to leave a lot of time for discussion. I didn't even get into Prop 13. I told Ms. Johnson that we could probably have a whole panel just on that, and I'd be happy to do that some other session. But let's have questions now. Thank you very much.
Excellent stuff, excellent. Well, with that segue, why don't we move on to audience Q&A? I know there's a question or two out there that we might have for our panelists. We should have a roving mic there in the back. Yes, sir, in the red.
Oh, okay. Yeah, David Hoyer from Houston. Question for Mr. Bonin. Interesting panel, a lot of good ideas. One thing that was not mentioned is that the announcements by the local taxing entities that run in the paper are written by idiots, it seems like to me. They follow this standard protocol where they talk about we're considering 2 rates and blah, 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 and a lot of legalese, and you can show up to the meetings. I can never understand. I have a graduate degree. I can't figure out what they're saying. So I think that's a reason why a lot of people don't show up to these meetings. But then if you do actually show up, which I have done, Harris County, a county of 4 million people, I've been to the meetings, I'm the only one there. And when you actually do show up, they're not really interested in hearing from you. It seems like the fix is in. They invariably have already decided to go with the higher rate of the 2 they're considering. So I guess my point is that I would, one fix for this problem would be to have greater transparency in these announcements in the newspaper, and maybe that would encourage more people to get involved with that issue.
No, I appreciate your comments, and I agree with you and I disagree with you. And what I mean is you're absolutely right. Those notices in the newspaper have been improved, which you might now want to laugh at me for saying, but they can be improved even more. Now, where I disagree with you, and I've had other people make the same comment to me about the notice in the newspaper and what have you, but with all due respect, if you're angry about your taxes, you don't need a notice in your newspaper. And let's be candid. I mean, all you got to do is show up to local governments and let them know this is not acceptable. And the reality of it is we should have those notices. We need to improve those notices. But the point is, all you need to know is that at the next council meeting or the next 2 council meetings, the next 2 commissioner meetings, they're talking about budget, taxes, and spending. You ought to be there. And you make the other point that's a great challenge that is bewildering to me. Folks don't show up. And, until we show up, we get the government we deserve. And until we learn the issues, I horrify school teachers all the time when I go speak to their classes. And I say, how many of you have been taught, you're told you have a responsibility to vote? And, they raise their hand. I said, you don't. You have a responsibility to learn the issues and then go vote as an educated voter. If you don't learn the issues, if you don't know the candidates, and you don't learn anything about what's happening in that election, I don't want you there. So, and I appreciate that greatly because many teachers then chew me out on the way out the door. But so I feel better today. But we do need to improve that notice greatly. But I think to a certain level, and it's one of the issues I've been very concerned about, is that by the legislature saying we're going to lower your property taxes, we're misleading the public also. We're saying don't go to the commissioner's court, don't go to the city council, don't go to the school board, just call us. When at the end of the day, there is only so far we can move that ball. Now, we need to move it every bit of the way we can down the road, and we have work to do there, but there is only so far we can get it without true engagement on the local level. And Cheryl's a friend, and, Cheryl's story's phenomenal. The problem with Cheryl's story is we don't have enough of them. No, in all sincerity. I mean, they're I deal with it all the time, and I'll be quiet with this, but, I see folks who come to me, they're upset about an issue, they engage for a month, 2, maybe 3, and then it's over. Now, the issue's not over, but they're done. And I get that. You're raising kids. You're doing homework. You're getting meals. You're working, all those things. But anyway, I hear you, and I agree, and that's something that actually Senator Betancourt is very engaged in, too. He and I both had a great meeting just before Thanksgiving, and he and I both recognize the point you're making, and we need to improve those notices. And again, I want to leave you with, not as an excuse, but just so you understand the silliness of them. We have done things to improve them, and they're still that bad.
I'd like to just add a word since we're talking about notices. I mentioned the notice of appraised value. I don't know if you've ever looked at it. I honestly didn't until this past year. It's 2 sides. It's covered with numbers. It's things that the legislature has added so that you will understand the 5-year history of each of your taxing jurisdictions, what your appraised value is. The trouble is it is so much information that probably nobody looks at any of it. And I think as part of the improvements that I'm hoping we can make in that notice is take a lot of that information. It's good information, but maybe move it to the web. have a QR or someplace where you can go and get that information for yourself, so that the only thing that's left on the piece of paper that you get is the stuff you really want to know, which is what's my appraised value, what are my exemptions and freezes and caps, and what is my taxable value, and make it really clear. I get my car insurance through State Farm. I'm sure plenty of you do. And a few years ago, they rewrote their notices. So it says, when it means me, it says you. It means the company. It's as clear as could be, and I don't see why the state and the cities couldn't do the same thing. In fact, council member, I think I got that notice that you placed up there with all the fees. I thought that was wonderful. It's always information I have wondered about. I don't know how I could have gotten it any other way. So I really appreciate that.
And I think Cheryl wants to say something on that, so while you're handing her the mic, Dick makes a great point. I think one of the big problems is that to a certain extent, we've over-notified. We have put way too much in there so that the average or even above average person's just going to gloss over at it. Bring it down to brass tacks, boil it down to simplicity. If that simplicity gets you excited, go to the web and get more info.
I quadrupled my Facebook hits this year. I have a tax office one and then I have a campaign one. And so I'd be at work and I'd be posting, this is what's happening and you need to pay attention. And then I'd go home and I'd post, this is what's happening, you need to be paying attention. And people, it did light up. It went across the whole state. I had the secretary in our office saying, hey, my friend in LaGrange, saw your post because a friend of a friend of a friend. So we can do a better job in government of communicating. We try. I labor over everything that goes in our tax statement every single year. And they bring us in the bill unopened. It has a newsletter, and they say, how much do I owe? It's like, you didn't read this? But I do believe that there are a couple of things, and sir, I understand your frustration. It took many years to change out the local elected officials in my county, a long, long time. And then you get them elected, and you think you can go home and pay attention to your life again, and you can't. You have to watch them like a hawk, and that's very frustrating. But I do believe that the state could look at lowering the appraisal cap, maybe extending it to all real property so we don't pit business, so it's equal among everybody. That would create some more accountability for our local governments because they wouldn't see so much incredible increases in those values. We could lower and equalize the revenue cap. I think it's unfair to have a school district at 4% and a drainage district at 8%, and it's automatic. It just gets plugged in to the effective tax rate calculations. Did y'all realize that? We came up with a 13, 15-step effective tax rate calculation that would be so simple that anybody could understand it, even us. When I have to serve on a panel to explain the effective tax rate calculation to a government, or I have to spend 2 hours explaining it to them in a meeting, that's not reasonable. That's not good. It may as well be an IRS tax form. So there are those three things that the legislature could look at. Simplifying truth and taxation would be really, really great. So I do believe that there are things that we could do, and I'm sorry for the frustration that you're having. You have so many city council members in Houston to change out.
I guess I just want to chime in and say that's exactly the reason that I passed the taxpayer impact statement for the city level, is to provide a really simple and clear idea in actual numbers of what your total tax and fee burden is, and the hope is that we can get more local entities to do that. And from the perspective of people not showing up to meetings, we had 2 full 8-hour days of people testifying or people coming to speak to the Austin City Council about the budget and what they wanted to see. Of hundreds of people, only 2 of them were not part of an interest group or not part of an organization who was asking for money. I mean, the vast majority of the people who showed up were people who wanted to make sure that their project was included in our budget. And only 2 average people showed up and said, hey, I'm just a regular homeowner. I'm really struggling. Can you please, not raise our taxes anymore? And I, of course, know that that's not representative at all of, certainly my district or even the city of Austin as a whole. But it's hard. I mean, when we talk about citizen engagement, nobody has time to not only go to the city of Austin, but also to the school board, also to the legislature, also to the county. I mean, all of these places to talk about these issues. So, and I think the average person just assumes that they elected representatives that have basic common sense, and unfortunately, a lot of times that's not the case. And so to me, this kind of just puts in perspective the importance of local election, of the election, to get the right person in office who you can trust to make those kinds of basic decisions that we think of as common sense. So,
Do we have another question? Aaron, can we get?
Prop 13 style idea seems to make a lot of sense to eliminate a lot of the things that people traditionally complain about in terms of the way property taxes are administered and distributed. What, if any, are the political obstacles to just passing a bill or a constitutional amendment or whatever it would take to achieve that here?
To pass it would require a constitutional amendment. We just started discussing in my office yesterday whether if we redefine market value, can we do it in the tax code, and I still have to look at that. I do believe it would require a constitutional amendment. One of my state reps kind of shivered when I told him that it would take that, and I don't understand. The only other thing I know is, and I know that there's a lot of state reps out there, and I support a representative government, but they have initiative for referendum in California, and quite honestly, it took 13 years to get the petition signatures to get that on the ballot, and like I said, it passed 2-1. So if the legislature isn't going to do it, then let's get an initiative for referendum and give it back to the people and let them tell us what they want.
Sounds great, but, and Cheryl won't appreciate this, but Prop 13 has not worked that successfully in California. It in essence creates what's called a split tax roll, and we respectfully acknowledged, James did in his opening, the Tax Foundation as an entity we all respect. Texas is currently ranked the 10th in the nation for being the best from a tax perspective for business. California is 48th, meaning third worst from a tax perspective for business. And Prop 13 is the probably most significant factor in that tax foundation assessment. So I think we need to be very careful that we don't create split tax rolls, that we don't create environments where we do not keep driving job growth. And the reality of it is, if you're driving job growth, you're driving personal income growth. And then if you're watching governments on their spending, you help resolve the problem.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, Russ. Can we get a mic?
Real quick, I read the brochure here from TPPF, and I agree that the short-term structural reform, at least from a policy perspective, that's a good idea, is the population growth and inflation limit on how quickly property tax burdens can grow. I walked in a little bit late, so I didn't hear if that was discussed and if the rationale was provided as to why that's a good idea. It adjusts for population growth, it adjusts for inflation, it's a structural limit. Governments tend to always grow themselves, and so this puts a structural limit in place. But it also accounts for appraisal growth. So it doesn't matter how quickly appraisals grow, because it'll automatically mean that tax rates will ratchet down if that was implemented to adjust for that. So can anyone talk about, I didn't hear that since we've been here, why that from a policy perspective in terms of structurally limiting government is such a good idea? And what is the political opposition to enacting a reform legislatively like that, as the other gentleman asked?
We came into session and Senator Betancourt had a bill to, I don't recall what he had it filed, what the filed version appeared as, but I think it was a 4% cap on revenue. Because the reality of it is an appraisal cap, which I've supported appraisal caps, those type things are nice, but you need to just cover the entire issue, which is rate and appraisal, so that'd be income or revenue. So I think Senator Betancourt had it at 6. They took it up, 4 is a filed version, I think, and then they took it up to 6% and did not have the votes to get it out of the Senate committee. For the gentleman from Houston who asked the question, if you're blessed and live in like the Clear Lake part of Houston, the gentleman in front of you, Representative Dennis Paul, passed a bill out of my committee that actually created a 6% revenue cap on local government. And I want to be clear, the big mistake that's made on revenue caps, and I don't want to only say that part because that's the opposition to your question, that's the opposition that comes in, is, oh my God, then what would we do if we needed more money and we wouldn't be able to do? All it does is create the most democratic thing in the world, in my opinion, which is says, if you need to go beyond 6%, go educate your voters, have an election, And if they believe that the reason you need to do that, if maybe there's a new road that everyone desperately wants built, and that's why, go get them. And your voters have told you that. And I'm not being cute about it. I've told local officials, if I were you, I would want that. Because you've now been given a vote of validation by your voters that you're raising a tax or a revenue is okay by me. I agree with your reasoning. Or they're going to tell you, I don't agree with your reasoning, and stop. And so the reality of it is, it is a challenge to do that. But Dennis Paul passed that bill out of my committee. I'm proud of him, and I'm proud of my committee for getting that done. We did not get it. It was late because the Senate, and I'm not blaming the Senate, but the Senate had kind of led on that issue, and so the House was waiting for the bill to come from the Senate. That bill never came, so we didn't get it to the full House, which I don't want to be disingenuous. I think it had been a question of whether it would have passed the House. I'm not saying it wouldn't have, but I don't want to sit and say, oh yeah, we would have slung that thing right on over there. But I think it's misunderstood some of the time that we're not stopping you at 6%, which I think is kind of high. I'd do it at 5 or 4, frankly. We're simply saying have an intelligent, educated discussion with your voters and your taxpayers. Just explain what you're doing. It's no different, and I'll be quiet with this, Cheryl. I know you want to say something.
Actually,
it's no different than a bond election. You go out and you explain why you're doing it, and the voters either say you're doing right or you're not doing right. It's that simplistic.
We'll have to actually end there, folks, but I want to let you know that the discussion will continue. We just launched our thinklocalliberty.com, our new local government website. We'll have all kinds of property tax information. I encourage you to go and visit our website, like us on Facebook. With that said, please help me thank our panel today.